Welcome to this brief video series on compassion-focused therapy. The aim of this series is to help us to understand, recognise and be kinder to ourselves about the things that we find difficult, and it's based on the work of Paul Gilbert, who developed compassion-focused therapy. So what we'll be looking at today is how we can learn to be more compassionate. We'll be considering firstly what we mean by compassion, the two key components of compassion, the different flows that exist or types of compassion, recognising the impact of having an inner critic, and that we can find self-compassion hard for lots of reasons, but we can get better at it with practice. So, what is compassion? Now, I'd like you just to take a moment to think about how you'd answer that question for yourself, and please feel free to pause the video and come back to it. Okay, so whether you just thought about it in your head or wrote something down, the things that most often come up when thinking about compassion are a lot of niceness. So it's about being kind, about being thoughtful. Nice is often the word that comes up. The thing that is most frequently missing when people think about compassion, and this is compassion in the sense that we mean it within compassion-focused therapy, is just how much strength and courage it requires. Quite often, the most compassionate next thing we could do for ourselves isn't always a very easy thing. So we have to dig deep and find the courage to be able to do the things that are truly helpful for us. So it is useful just thinking about what your understanding of compassion is and how to bring it more in line of this really warm, wise and strong version of compassion that we mean in compassion-focused therapy and in this mini video series. So if we think about compassion on being compassionate and what it involves, we would think about there being two specific components. So the first one is thinking about how we engage with distress, and obviously we're talking about engaging effectively with distress. The second thing is where we do something about it, and I've got in brackets there wise. So what I mean is that doing something that helps to alleviate distress. If we only do one or the other, we can often end up in quite a difficult space. Being deeply connected, tuned in and aware of our distress, but not doing anything to alleviate it can be a very distressing place to be. We can feel really stuck. Equally, doing lots, but not necessarily wise things, can just serve to keep us disconnected and out of tune with how we're really feeling. So we're going to be looking at having both of those parts strengthened and developed in order to help us become more compassionate. So we'll look at those in each turn. Firstly, thinking about engaging with distress effectively, what are some of the qualities involved in that? Well, the first thing we would think about is having care for well-being. So that might well be having the well-being of others, others' best interests at heart. But also in compassion and compassion-focused therapy, we're talking about having care for our own well-being. And sometimes the things that genuinely help our well-being might not be that easy, as I said in the earlier slides. It's also important to say, though, that this isn't about prioritising our care over others, much more about learning to keep a balance of keeping both in mind. There's also something about the quality of sensitivity, and this is central to compassion. It's how we tune into ourselves. All too often in this world, especially if things are painful or difficult, I guess there's something relatively logical about not tuning in or not being sensitive to our distress. But if we're truly going to work on it, it is absolutely critical that we do allow ourselves to lean into the things that we feel and what we might find difficult. Thinking next then about sympathy. So this is about feeling the connectedness that comes with tuning in and feeling the pain of ourselves or others. And really important, I guess, sympathy, it involves being moved by what we're feeling. Now, non-judgment, and I guess we can also say that, judgment is a very common part of the human experience, but it's often not very helpful or kind to ourselves or others. So what we're looking at here with non-judgment is increasing the scope to look at things from different perspectives and to help ourselves to become more reflective. Moving then to empathy. So empathy is about being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And what it does by reinforcing this quality is allowing ourselves to look at things from different perspectives. And it often gives us more options for how to make sense of situations. And lastly, distress tolerance. So this is about, I guess, allowing ourselves to experience the feelings that we're having, not suppressing them, not numbing out to them, and not distracting ourselves from them, but also having the skills to be able to tolerate the distress that we're feeling. Moving then to the second component, or the second psychology of compassion, and that's about alleviating distress, doing something in response to having tuned into the distress. Now, the first of these is about developing compassionate attention. So when we think about attention, most of us get caught up or focus our attention on things in a way that might fuel our stress or distress. It might be habit, autopilot, or perhaps that our threat system is on high alert and hypervigilant, looking out for things in our environment that we might need to be aware of. But having compassionate attention is learning to focus on things that support and help us. So there are skills-based trainings in the compassionate mind training that help us reinforce those skills. Next, we move to compassionate imagery. So I guess this is about acknowledging that we can use our imagination in really powerful ways. I mean, if you just think about it for a moment, if we were to bring to mind a memory of a strong reaction that we had to something, and we really recall it in vivid detail, whether it's good or bad, we can often find ourselves, our bodies, re-experiencing the same things just by being able to call it to our imagination. So what we want to do is use this power, the power of imagination, to strengthen our compassionate self. Next, we move to compassionate reasoning and thinking. So all too often, our reasoning and thinking isn't particularly compassionate. We might be, worrying about the future, all the what ifs. What if this? What if that? We might be thinking back over difficult things that have happened. So that might be ruminating on past events. Or we might be thinking about ourselves in a harsh or uncompassionate way. It's very common that we would talk to ourselves in a way that we won't actually speak to any other person. So we can have this particularly harsh inner critic or inner bully. So instead of that, what we're looking at here with learning to alleviate our distress is helping to orient our reasoning and our thinking in tuning into more helpful ways of approaching our situations. So what might be a helpful way to think about what's going on? Or perhaps using thinking skills like, if someone I loved about was in this similar position, what would I suggest that they do? Or how would I talk to them? So it's allowing us to draw on different ways of thinking about a situation. Next, it's compassionate behaviour. So as we already thought about earlier on when we were looking at the definition of compassion, real compassion, is not just about being nice. So it's about having behaviours that reinforce a much more genuine compassion. So really tuning into what is the most helpful thing I can do right now. Quite often that may not be an easy thing and will require bravery. Next, we have developing the skills of compassionate sensory focusing. So what that is developing skills in using our senses, so that's all of our senses, what we can hear, smell, see, touch, taste, to help manage our stress and distress. So it can be very good in helping us to tolerate distress and helps us activate our soothing system. So again, there are lots of apps now available that can really help guide us through and talk about how to use our senses to regulate our distress. And the last area in alleviating our distress is how we can strengthen our compassionate feelings. So this also works on building our compassionate self. So it's about nurturing those positive emotions that are linked to compassion. So we might be thinking of things like warmth, kindness, connectedness, and bravery. and how we really help tune into and reinforce those. So there's also something about the 3 flows of compassion. So compassion-focused therapy identifies compassion as not just being one thing, but actually we can experience and give compassion in a variety of ways. We can give compassion to other people, we can receive compassion from other people, and lastly we can give compassion to ourselves. Now, it's helpful to think about how you sit in relation to each of these 3. People tend to find some of these easier than others. And I do say, we've talked about people. It may not be about giving or receiving compassion to people. It might be a pet or a plant or just something, some other entity that you are able to either give or receive compassion to. What we do then is nurture how that feels, is recognise that we do have the ability to connect with compassion, and that enables us to build on that and use it in other ways. Most people find giving compassion to themselves the harder of the 3, or at least the least practiced when they first come to compassion-focused therapy. So be gentle with yourself, draw on what you already do and know, and then let's think about how we can apply it across all 3 flows of compassion. Thinking now then about our inner critic, some people might call this our inner bully, and how it can make us feel. Now, most of us do have an inner critic. It's that little voice in the back of our head that kind of walks along our day-to-day living and telling us maybe what we're doing wrong, what we said, something you shouldn't have said that, you've just embarrassed yourself. It's just a running dialogue that all too often is harsh and unkind, and often uses a tone and words that we would never use when speaking to other people. So we can have a particularly critical approach to ourselves. Now, just for some, this is the first time that we really become aware, gosh, I do that. I do have this really harsh inner critic. And that awareness is the very first step to being able to build those compassionate skills to actually help change how we feel about ourselves and how we speak to ourselves. So thinking then about this inner critic or bully, something that can be useful to think about is, what is it trying to help us with? What is it trying to help me do? Just a couple of examples, and there will be many more, but for some people, their harsh inner critic is about trying to help them get things done, push them harder, or to maintain high standards, perfection, or to really do well in things. For some, it's an inner way of speaking to themselves to help feel in control, or perhaps about making us be a good person and force us to do things that we think are in the interests of others. Lastly, it may be about protecting ourselves. That what stemmed from an initially positive intention over time has become a very difficult experience and results in a narrative and ways of speaking and relating to ourselves that are very harsh. And I guess this brings us to, if it was easy, wouldn't we just all be doing and living self-compassionate lives? Well, there are things that can get in the way of approaching a more self-compassionate or compassionate way of living our lives. It might be that we think being compassionate is selfish or a get-out. So a very good example of compassion is action is I'm now doing this video with a really tickly throat, and I think my inner critic is slightly criticising myself for not having had a drink beforehand or worrying what this will be like to watch, or even if I need to start all over again. But I think that there's something about keeping this imperfection in the video that is really helpful when we think about self-compassion, because actually it's how we're kind to ourselves in lots of little ways all the time. So it's not huge, big stuff every so often. It's those small steps, day by day by day, to allow ourselves to be gentler and kinder. So we were thinking about what can get in the way of self-compassion. It might feel scary. It might feel like times when people have been nice to us, they've gone on to do bad things. And so it doesn't feel particularly safe to experience compassion from other people. That then gets in the way of self-compassion. It might be that we don't trust people. It might be that it seems selfish, or it might be that we've just never really experienced it before. Just the way that our life has been, we haven't really had the experiences that allow us to recognise what it feels like. So in those cases, it takes a bit more work, but it is absolutely something that is worth pursuing in order to live a gentler, kinder, more compassionate life. Now, something that can help us tune into what would be a compassionate set of ideals for us is to spend a moment to do this brief thought exercise. So think about what an ideal friend, coach, or teacher would be for you. What would their qualities? How would they speak to you? What would their energy level be like? What would their sense of maybe their age? Do they seem calming? Do they seem motivating? What is their body posture like? What is their facial expression? And actually you can start to build up not only a sense of what are the things that help you tune into compassion, but this is one of the exercises in compassionate mind training that helps us imagine the compassionate other. And the more we enrich this and build on it, the more we're able to then start to use this image of a compassionate friend or a compassionate coach to actually bring a different way of looking at a situation, to bring that perspective of soothing and calming ourselves. So in compassion focused therapy, it's not about getting rid of the bad feelings, but about honouring them. It's about thinking about how we respond to them. Thank you for listening.